At 10:12 a.m. on February 28, 2026, in Iran. At Iran's southern naval bases, particularly Bandar Abbas and Chabahar, an inferno unlike anything in the history of the Iranian Navy suddenly erupted. Dozens of Tomahawk cruise missiles surged in from the direction of the Gulf of Oman, skimming just above the surface of the sea at roughly Mach 0.74, equivalent to nearly 550 miles per hour. At that speed, Iran's air defense network had virtually no chance to intercept them. Before Iranian commanders could even understand what was happening, warheads weighing nearly 990 pounds began slamming into the harbor area, detonating among warships moored along the docks. A fleet that had taken Iran more than a decade to assemble was now being crushed by the United States in less than 1 minute. 27 minutes earlier, in the Gulf of Oman, 2 U.S. Navy destroyers had quietly moved into position before dawn. On their decks, the vertical launch cells of the VLS system opened one by one as the launch authorization was confirmed. Within seconds, the first Tomahawk cruise missiles erupted from their tubes, shooting upward into the sky before quickly descending to skim just above the sea. In less than 2 minutes, dozens of Tomahawks had left their launch cells. The small turbofan engines at their tails roared to life as the missiles accelerated toward their cruising speed. Flying at an altitude of only a few dozen meters above the water, roughly 100 feet, the missiles almost disappeared from the detection range of most coastal radars. A storm of firepower was now silently moving toward the Iranian naval fleet, where many warships still sat moored at their piers, completely unaware of what was approaching. The distance from the launch position in the Gulf of Oman to Iran's southern naval bases measured several hundred miles. At a cruising speed close to 550 miles per hour, that meant nearly 40 minutes of exposure to potential radar detection. If even a single coastal radar station detected them at the right moment, the entire missile wave could be revealed. But everything had been calculated in advance. Just as the Tomahawk missiles approached the Iranian coastline, Iran's air defense network suddenly faced an entirely different threat. Across multiple coastal radar screens, dozens of small airborne targets abruptly appeared from several directions. They flew slowly, at low altitude, and without any clear formation. Some even changed course repeatedly, making classification far more difficult. Within seconds, radar operators had to determine whether these contacts were reconnaissance UAVs, attack drones, or merely radar interference. That moment of hesitation in the first few seconds forced the air defense crews into a rapid decision: fire to protect the site. The first interceptor missile launched, a Sayyad-4 interceptor from the Bavar 373 air defense system, estimated to cost nearly $1 million, shot skyward. Its rocket motor accelerated the missile rapidly to supersonic speed as the fire control radar locked onto the target ahead. Seconds later, fragments of a UAV fell into the coastal waters. But it was not a Tomahawk. What had just been destroyed was merely a small drone worth only a few tens of thousands of dollars, launched in advance to trigger the air defense response. The radar officer barely had time to process the situation. On the screen, new targets were still appearing. Some moved deeper inland, others maneuvered laterally along the coastline. Each one could potentially carry a warhead aimed directly at his air defense battery. According to standard engagement procedures, any unidentified aerial contact approaching the site had to be destroyed before it could strike. The order came again: fire. Another interceptor missile launched, then another. Each time a missile fired, the fire control radar had to emit stronger signals to guide the interceptor toward its target. Those radar pulses swept across the skies of southern Iran, unintentionally revealing the exact positions of the air defense sites. Hundreds of miles away, coalition electronic intelligence systems recorded every one of those signals. On their tactical screens, Iranian radar stations were now appearing one by one, each marked with precise coordinates. While Iranian air defense crews believed they were repelling a wave of drones, the real attack was still approaching behind them. Over the Gulf of Oman, the Tomahawk missiles had already traveled more than half the distance to their targets. Flying only a few dozen meters above the sea surface, roughly 100 feet, they blended almost perfectly into the radar clutter created by ocean waves. Coastal radars would only detect them once they were already extremely close. When the missiles were roughly 7.5 miles from their targets, Iranian coastal early warning radars began to notice something unusual. At the edge of their screens, new signals appeared, small, low, and moving with steady speed. At first, they resembled radar clutter generated by sea waves, but within seconds, the signal processing system began classifying them as high-speed aerial targets. By the time the warning reached the Coastal Command Center, those signals were already very close to the shoreline. And traveling at nearly 560 miles per hour, the air defense network now had less than 1 minute to react. The first Tomahawk crossed the coastline at an altitude of under 100 feet, almost skimming the water before its guidance system executed a final trajectory correction. Operators attempted to lock onto the target, but the missile had already entered its terminal attack phase. At a distance of only a few kilometers, roughly 2 to 3 miles, there was no longer enough time for an interception. Seconds later, the 990-pound warhead slammed directly into the pier area of the Iranian naval base. A massive explosion erupted along the shore of the Gulf of Oman. The shockwave rolled across the water like an invisible wall, shaking the entire harbor area. A warship moored at the pier was violently thrown to one side as the forward section of its deck disappeared into flames. But that missile was only the beginning of the attack. Behind it, more Tomahawks were already crossing the coastline through different flight corridors. Each missile had been pre-programmed with its own specific target inside the base. Offshore in the Gulf of Oman, the U.S. destroyers continued monitoring the entire operation through their tactical data link systems. On their tactical displays, coastal targets began appearing one by one. Just as the naval base descended into chaos, with multiple electrical systems ashore destroyed in the opening seconds of the strike, the next wave of Tomahawks entered the harbor area. The first missile plunged toward the pier where the Mauj-class destroyer Jamaran was moored. This vessel was one of the largest warships in the Iranian Navy in that region. It carried Noor anti-ship missiles and its own onboard air defense systems, with an estimated value of $120 to $150 million. The Tomahawk warhead punched through the forward deck before detonating inside the engineering compartment. The explosion destroyed the ship's main electrical systems, sending violent tremors through the hull as the vessel began listing heavily to starboard, while seawater poured into the ship. Only seconds later, another Tomahawk locked directly onto the Bayandor-class frigate Iris Bayandor, an older vessel but still active in Iran's coastal patrol forces. The missile descended at a shallow angle and detonated just behind the ship's command tower. The explosion tore open the hull and sent a towering column of fire rising above the pier. Within minutes, the vessel had completely lost its combat capability. On the opposite side of the dock, two Sina-class fast attack missile boats had only just started their engines when the next wave of missiles arrived. A Tomahawk detonated directly in the middle of the cluster of ships, throwing one vessel partially out of the water, while the other had its stern section destroyed by the shockwave. Fragments of metal and shattered debris from the pier scattered across the bay. In less than 1 minute, both fast attack boats had been reduced to burning hulks drifting near the shoreline. Meanwhile, in the inner anchorage of the bay, a Hengam-class landing ship attempted to leave the harbor in order to escape the attack zone. But just as the vessel began turning its bow, another Tomahawk plunged in from a low angle and detonated near the engine compartment. The explosion instantly stripped the ship of all maneuverability. Thick black smoke rose from the hull as seawater poured through large breaches along the vessel's side. The next missiles continued descending onto remaining targets across the naval base. A Common-class patrol boat was destroyed at its berth. a Bandar Abbas-class naval logistics ship suffered a direct hit that set its entire cargo compartment ablaze. Another smaller patrol vessel was overturned by the shockwave of a nearby explosion and sank into the shallow waters of the bay. Within minutes, the entire harbor area had turned into a sea of fire. On coalition reconnaissance screens, the icons representing Iranian warships began disappearing from the tactical map one by one. When the final wave of Tomahawk missiles ended, a total of 9 Iranian naval vessels and support ships had been destroyed or sunk at bases along the Gulf of Oman. The estimated financial damage exceeded $400 million. And as smoke continued rising from the docks, one fact became clear to both sides. Most of Iran's naval forces in this region had been eliminated in the very first minutes of Operation Epic Fury. Columns of smoke were still rising from Bandar Abbas and Chabahar as the sun climbed higher above the Gulf of Oman. Technical teams rushed along shattered piers, attempting to contain fires and assess the damage. Some warships lay tilted against the docks. Others had partially sunk in the shallow waters of the harbor. During the first hours, no one could determine exactly how many vessels had been taken out of action. But one thing was already clear. The operational tempo of the Iranian Navy had been shattered from the very beginning. When a fleet base falls into emergency conditions, the ability to deploy naval forces to sea is almost instantly paralyzed. Meanwhile, offshore in the Gulf of Oman, no counterattack formation appeared. The ships that remained intact inside the harbor were still dealing with fires, power outages, or severe system damage. Destroyed piers made it extremely difficult for vessels to depart their berths. Several coastal command systems and radar installations had also been struck earlier, disrupting coordination across the region. In naval warfare, losing the ability to deploy forces during the first hours of conflict can be more decisive than losing ships themselves. A few hours later, initial reports began appearing across international media outlets. Multiple sources mentioned vessels from the Bandar, Alvand, and Jamaran classes among the ships struck at coastal bases. Several support platforms and naval logistics ships in the harbor area were also believed to have suffered heavy damage during the first wave of attacks. Not all information was immediately confirmed. But when satellite imagery revealed multiple large fires burning across key piers, the overall picture began to emerge. Iran's fleet had taken a direct hit at its own mooring points. A few hours later, the political headline of the operation appeared. The President of the United States announced that American forces had destroyed and sunk 9 Iranian naval vessels during the opening phase of the campaign. The number quickly became a headline across international news networks. It represented not only material losses, it also carried a strategic message. The primary objective of the operation had been achieved within the first hours of the conflict. But for military analysts, the significance of the operation did not lie entirely in the number 9. The more important question was whether the Iranian fleet could still act immediately. Subsequent analyses repeatedly pointed to one detail. Before the operation began, Iran was believed to have approximately 11 warships and support vessels operating in the Gulf of Oman region. After the initial strikes, U.S. officials declared that no Iranian naval vessels remained capable of maintaining a tactical presence in the area. That did not necessarily mean every ship had been completely destroyed, but it meant none of them were capable of leaving port and deploying at sea at the moment the crisis began. But blocking a strait requires more than declarations. It requires naval forces at sea. A genuine blockade operation demands warships, fast attack craft, mini-submarines, and a logistics network capable of continuous operation. Those forces must be able to leave port quickly, maneuver in formation, and maintain presence at sea for days at a time. When naval bases are struck, when piers are burning, and when warships are sinking directly at their berths, organizing such an operation becomes almost impossible in the short term. And that was precisely the strategic objective of the strikes on the first day. Not to destroy every last ship, but to shatter the immediate operational capability of the entire fleet. When a navy loses its ability to act during the first hours of a crisis, its maritime deterrence collapses as well. A threat to blockade a strait only has meaning if warships can actually appear on the water to enforce it. If the fleet is still busy dealing with damage inside its own harbors, that strategic leverage temporarily loses its effect. And in international crises, time is often the decisive factor. Looking back at the entire sequence of events, the structure of the operation becomes quite clear. First, the surveillance network was disrupted using decoy UAVs. Next, the air defense batteries were forced to activate their radars, exposing their positions. Then, Tomahawk strikes targeted radar sites, command centers, and base infrastructure. Finally, additional missiles were directed straight at the warships still moored at the docks. Each layer of the attack did not need to be perfect. It only needed to slow the opponent by one step, and when multiple delays accumulate, the entire system begins to lose its rhythm. Along the southern coast of Iran, the remaining ships still sat at their piers, while smoke continued to rise from the damaged naval bases. Those ships still existed, but they did not appear in the Gulf of Oman on the first day of the crisis. And that fact alone was enough to alter the initial balance of the confrontation at sea. A naval operation does not always require a massive fleet battle to create strategic consequences. Sometimes it only needs to prevent the opponent from reaching the sea at the critical moment. And when that happens, the number 9 ships is no longer the most important detail of the story. What matters more is that a fleet once viewed as a tool of maritime deterrence was forced to remain inside its own harbor at the very moment the crisis began. That is how a military operation can shift the regional balance of power within the first few hours.